Can you say
Hello, 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 mic test. It's okay. Hello, mic test. Hello, mic test. Hello. How is it? Hello, mic test, mic test. Hello, hello. Hello, mic test. Hello, mic test. Hello.
Hello.
It's okay.
Welcome back from the lunch break, everyone. Council, are we ready to continue? If we are, please get the witness.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We are ready to proceed. Please bring in the witness.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back, Professor Saine.
Thank you.
Before the lunch break, you took us through the background and methodology used in your report. You also answered some of the questions that we have provided. You've gone up to question 3, which is to explain how former President Jammeh evolved from a low-ranking military ruler to a deified dictator presiding over a regime marked by allegations of widespread violations and abuses. And you explained the worldview of Yahya Jammeh and what made him tick, and how he evolved to really become a dictator. I want us to move the discussion forward and talk about a bit about his upbringing and how that had contributed to him being what he eventually became, especially starting with his days in Kanilai and growing up in the urban area, and how all that contributed in making him what he ultimately become. For the purposes of the report, you have gone as far as paragraph 50.
Paragraph 50?
Yes.
Okay.
But that is page 19.
Okay.
But what I found interesting is this question that you raised in paragraph 49, wherein you said that some people seem to think that Jammeh lacks the cultural comportment of a true Gambian.
Yes.
And your response to that is quite interesting. Can you take it from there?
Well, thank you, Counsel. Jammeh has been, to some degree, deified, but also vilified. And by that I mean that people say he's not Gambian. He doesn't have the temperament of a Gambian. He does things that are unbecoming of Gambians. And what I'm basically suggesting is that Gambia, and Jammeh in particular, and the character that we assume to be Gambian, are very much intertwined. And in this part of the report, what I wanted to do was to disabuse readers of the notion that, well, Kibo Kuchiniun, he is of another mentality, but he has been cut from the same sinew, from the same cloth. He went through the same experiences that most Gambians would typically go through. And as a result, I believe many Gambians, if they were to be put in Jammeh's position, given his training, his background, his ideology, his operational code, not all, but some would behave in a similar manner. And we have seen instances of that. I might probably just read the first 49.
Go ahead.
If that's okay.
Go ahead.
Basically, to delve deeper into them, I basically delve into political psychology to explore Jammeh's operational code, in codes. However, before doing so, it is important that Gambians in general be disabused of the belief that Yahya Jammeh was not a Gambian, implying he lacked the cultural comportment and empathy Gambians are believed to possess. Contrary to the popular notion that Yahya Jammeh was not one of us, that is, if he were Gambian, he would not be capable of allegedly committing horrific crimes against other Gambians. I contend that Jammeh is as Gambian as they come. He is quintessentially Gambian and exemplified the best and the worst of Gambia's national attributes and cultural heritage and baggage. In sum, he is one of us, and he's no different from many people.
Why do you say so? What is your basis? I think that is captured from paragraph 50 onwards.
Yes.
You tried to dissect
Yes.
some of the personal idiosyncrasies of Jammeh. Could you take us through that?
Okay. Following the 1994 coup, Jammeh and his conspirators held out the promise of a reformer dedicated to addressing social and economic ills in society. By the end of his first year in office, however, troubling and destructive tendencies emerged that linked him to other dictators in the continent and elsewhere. His quest for absolute power, propelled by greed, jealousy, self-delusion, self-aggrandizement, surfaced to the top of his grandiose political agenda. Thus, Yahya Jammeh is the embodiment of the best and the worst of Gambian culture, shaped as he was by a cultural, social, religious, and ideological environment within which he, like most Gambians, grew up under. I will discuss this later, as I say, when I talk about Alhaji Kani, Sana Bayro Sabali, and so forth and so on.
You have used in this paragraph interesting adjectives or phrases that describe Yahya Jammeh.
Mm-hmm.
Quest for absolute power, greed, jealousy, self-delusion, and self-aggrandizement.
Mm-hmm.
Can we find all these in Yahya Jammeh?
I believe so. I believe they are all interrelated. And maybe I'm talking about the same thing in different ways.
Well, I just want to think that if all these were to be found in one human being, that person would become something else, uncontrollable.
Well, I think Jammeh was uncontrollable.
An animal.
I believe he exhibited a lot of these tendencies. I believe truly that Jammeh exemplified all these tendencies. I mean, self-aggrandizement.
Is that why you suggested that similar characteristics can be seen in others with Jammeh, like Sana Sabali, who presided over a reign of terror that included the calculated and cold-blooded executions of military officers on November 10 and 11.
Yes.
That was just a quote from the report.
From the text, yes.
And you went on to say that Sabali's testimony was chilling as it highlighted how military officers accused of staging a coup on November 10 and 11 were systematically and brutally executed.
Yes.
So these are all characteristics.
These are all characteristics that might come also from their training, or more importantly, from their own psychological makeup. And maybe they exemplify the most extreme cases. But I think these are tendencies that you find in people like Jammeh and Sabali. I think we also embody, we also harbor some of those elements in ourselves. And if we were to find ourselves in similar situations, some of us may exhibit similar tendencies. But for the majority of the population, these tendencies tend to lie dormant.
Thank you.
Yes.
In paragraph 51, you went on to explain how a convergence of different things helps shape the operational code of JAME, as it were.
Yeah.
I guess you'd be in a better position to explain it.
Yes.
You talked about his formative years and in Jola settings,
yes,
and how he later changed into. Could you tell us more about paragraph 51, please?
Paragraph 51 was intended primarily to give a composite picture of who Yahya Jammeh really is. He is the byproduct of African cultures, Jola, and other ethnic groups that inhabited his village. He also was exposed to Christianity and Islam. He also, after coming to Banjul and finding himself in a larger political and cultural milieu, felt in many ways marginalized. I believe this created some resentment, among other things. And I think I believe he really was traumatized by his marginality. Am I going to?
No. I just want to shift the discussion briefly to various aspects of Jammeh's life.
Okay.
He straddled between reggae music, Bob Marley,
Yes.
and typical Jola music, Futampaf.
Yes.
He would carry a Quran, and people would say he would also do Jalang. How can you explain all this?
Well,
this admixture.
It is apparently very contradictory. I think one way of explaining Jammeh is looking at his actions and his utterances within a context. Jammeh could be quoting from the Quran, he could be doing sacrifices, he could also be talking about human rights from a Western perspective. He could also be talking about human rights from an Islamic perspective. It would depend on the audience he is catering to or he is pandering to, and what purpose it serves for him.
In fact, in paragraph 52, you said as follows. It is these overlapping, interconnected, concentric impulses that at times were complementary and at other times contradictory that swirled in his young mind.
Absolutely.
Confusion or deliberate?
I think he was confused in some ways. But at the end of the day, I believe Yahya Jammeh used, for the most part, those elements to serve his overall interests. Sometimes they're overarching, sometimes he would emphasize one at the expense of the other, but they really provide the corpus of his mentality.
Just a little while ago, before I interrupted you, you talked about growing up in Banjul or environs, and he adopted Ndongo culture pretty much, which is different from Bandi, by the way.
Yes.
Ndongo culture meaning streetwise, Nyayele as they would call it in Mandinka.
Yes.
How, and the grievances that he developed during those early years, how has that impacted on his life in the army? How he acclimated to the military, and the resultant effect. I am referring specifically to paragraphs 53, 54
okay.
of page 20,
Okay.
and the subsequent paragraphs in page 21.
I think Jammeh's move to the urban area, in Banjul in particular, and attending Gambia High, exposed his insecurities further. He became very vulnerable and increasingly vented out against what he perceived as inequities within society. He wasn't privileged. He didn't get the rights. He was really living with somebody who basically took care of him. So he was of a class and of an ethnic minority that for the most part didn't get a fair shake. These were grievances, I believe, that he took to the military. And the military was a very easy conduit, a place where he could express, or at least harbor them at some point, and expressing them much later by the way of a coup d'etat.
In paragraph 54, specifically page 21,
Yes.
starting from the middle of the first line,
Okay.
Starting with the sentence, the world from his vantage point. Could you read that, the rest of that paragraph?
Okay.
Please?
The world from his vantage point was grim, unfair, and unjust. The rich took advantage of the poor, and his socially marginalized Jola ethnic group enjoyed fewer opportunities for social mobility in the army, civil service, and the larger society. Yaya's social construction of the world was that of a dog-eat-dog world, where you had to act fast and decisively to outsmart the enemy. These dim views blended well, generally, with his negative traditional Muslim Christian beliefs and were reinforced by his military training and organizational military culture. In sum, Yahya was or is a political realist.
You went on to examine some of the influences that Yahya has had, especially so-called revolutionaries in Africa. Could you tell us about that, in particular paragraph 56?
I believe Yahya was not only influenced by his training overseas. I'm sure he interacted with professors and students and debated them on one thing or the other about military strategy and operational activity. But I think he also was very much influenced or emulated people like Idi Amin, Mobutu Sese Seko, Sana Abacha. They served as a model of a strong leader, of a military leader who could take over a country and rule it as he wished, vanquishing anybody who stood in his way. So these were some of the influences that shaped Jammeh. Rawlings, in particular, I believe, was fundamental in shaping his worldview and the transition period. You mentioned the article I did between Gambia, comparing Gambia and Ghana and their transitions to democracy. Gambia's transition to democracy under Jammeh was a carbon copy of Ghana's. In fact, the rhetoric of Jammeh was very much that of Rawlings. And he influenced him very, very much. In fact, it wasn't a surprise that during the first anniversary following the coup, Chairman Rawlings was the guest of honor.
And the first mission
Yes.
outside the country carried out by the AFPRC
Was to Ghana.
was to Ghana.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
that's not surprising. So you concluded in paragraph 57
Yes.
to tell us what you think of this mix
Yes.
that this cocktail that constituted Yahya Jammeh. Could you read that paragraph, please?
My pleasure. In sum, Yahya Jammeh, the dictator, has a cognitive map that is the byproduct of his African Jora heritage, religious upbringing, education, which means Islamic, Christian, and religious and other things, in his village, and certainly in Banjul. To this must be added his initial training in the army, officer training overseas, and his exposure to various intellectual and professional currents. Being a child of several worlds like most Gambians, he had enough imagination to dip from one tradition to another, or one of these traditions and their combinations, to form his operational code. These would have been the prisms through which he analyzed situations and challenges important for policy decisions. To some degree, this may explain what appeared to most of his contradictory and often confusing behavior. While professing to be a good Muslim, Jammeh is known to have taken mile-altering drugs, engaged in wanton acts of cruelty and debauchery, all while consuming or consulting a pantheon of gods, praying to Allah, to Jesus, and engaged in alleged human sacrifices.
Serious contradictions.
Yes.
Paragraphs 58 and also 59
Yes.
are quite significant. I'd suggest that you just read them.
Read them again, okay.
Yeah.
He was also a deeply suspicious, cynical, and narcissistic individual who, in the latter days of his misrule, exhibited all the pathologies of a leader gone mad. Power drunk, Jammeh felt he owned the country and all that resided in it. It was his country, and no one dared tell him how to run it. Oddly, Jammeh was also a bright and socially competent Gambian person who had a sense of humor and could dance to Bob Marley tunes and gyrate to the music of Jaliba Kuyate and Youssou N'Dour. And in his quiet moments, may have even contemplated the moral and ethical implications of his deadly actions. This is where it would appear he exhibited a serious case of cognitive dissonance.
And you concluded?
In sum, Jammeh is a political animal who understood his soldiers and human nature. He also comprehended the general worldview of most Gambians, which he used, abused, and manipulated to expose the shady tendencies in them. He knew and used to his advantage ills of the so-called Gambian personality: greed, lust for power, pride, competitive streak to outdo one another, socially and economically. Many elite servants or civil servants who danced to his tune ended disgraced, rehired, and forever silenced and discredited. Jammeh knew and understood well their weaknesses and hunger for power, and he ensnared them, or this part of them, or their personalities, to serve his perverse mission to control and dominate Gambian politics or the Gambian landscape. Predictably, many, too, would have acted like Jammeh if placed in a similar situation.
Thank you for that. We've discussed the Stockholm Syndrome earlier, and many people definitely exhibited such tendencies.
Yes.
We now move on to the fourth question that you were asked to look into. That is, provide a general overview of the nature, extent, system, and pattern of alleged abuses and violations of human rights that were characteristic of the Jammeh regime. And this should include an overview of the experiences of different social groups, including women and children. I note that when you looked at this, you looked at it in terms of the various generation of rights to which Gambia is a party. So could you help take us through that?
Well, over the last decades, since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, there have been, over time, a generation of rights or baskets of rights that have been put into action. Of course, clearly one of the most important are the conventions for political and civil rights, which gives emphasis to individual freedoms of expression, assembly, religion, and so forth and so on. There was also another convention on social and economic rights that basically emphasized, among other things, the right to health, education, food, shelter, and so forth and so on. Now, you will recall that this was in the context of the Cold War, when there was competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. The United States and most Western countries tended to prioritize or privilege political and civil rights as opposed to social and economic rights. And it was in this context that I tried to situate that answer. Now, later on, there were other rights, cultural rights, CEDAW, which is the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women. These are all baskets of rights.
Discrimination against women.
Against women, yes. And children's rights and so forth and so on. What I'm basically suggesting is, in order to understand the kind of rights abuses, it may be important to locate those abuses within the context of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and looking at those baskets or generations of rights and how they were violated systematically under Jammeh. One of the things that I also suggest is that, it created a problem. It did create a problem amongst other rights notions. By that I mean, this is a liberal vision of rights, especially political and social rights, political and civil rights. They come from a history of Western democratic impulses. Now, there are others who believe that there was an attempt to universalize them. And in doing so, it marginalizes other cultural sensibilities and views about human rights, especially as it relates to Sharia and other traditional cultural rights. In other words, there was a conflict between universal rights on one hand and domestic cultural rights. There has always been that tension between the two. Are we obligated by being signatories to these conventions to dampen or in fact eliminate practices like female circumcision? Because some would argue that is a direct contradiction. It contravenes CEDAW amongst other conventions. So in my analysis, therefore, I try to provide a broader political, historical Cold War context of rights, and that these rights, in fact, are contingent, and they are sometimes inspired by ideology so much than practice.
That's right. Can we then focus the discussion on the Convention on Political and Civil Rights, or Civic Rights for that
Okay,
matter. The Universal Declaration, basically.
yes. You want me to focus on that?
Yes, paragraph 64, Convention on Political and Civil Rights, or
Okay.
Civil and Political Rights. I noticed that you trace the history
Yes,
of this school of thought
absolutely.
from the English Enlightenment period, Hugo Grotius and Thomas Hobbes, John
Yes.
Locke, and so forth. Could you carry further this discussion to show what these rights entail and how those rights were dealt with under Jammeh?
These rights really form the corpus of the liberal tradition when it comes to human rights. People, given their natural endowments as humans, are entitled to protections from the state. The state ought not encumber or limit their enjoyment of life, liberty, and happiness. These rights also entail rights to a free trial when accused of a crime. They also guarantee the right to assemble, to protest, and to engage in expression that may not be welcomed by states. These states, or these rights go a long way back to the 17th and 1800s, from the English Enlightenment, I argue. In some, they basically say, and I read from item number 1 on page 24, human beings possess inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Under this convention, states are obligated to protect citizens to freely exercise rights to expression, assembly, religion, fair trial, and the vote, among other things. And then the primary function of government, I say in Article 2, the primary function of government is to protect these rights, including property rights. And political institutions are to be judged on their performance, and political obligations rest on their successful delivery. Thus, political life is based on a social contract between the people and the government, in sum.
You went on to explain that pretty much in the implementation of that social contract, Yahya Jammeh's behavior pretty much lacked coherence and precision. He would generally use elements from these traditions or their combinations
Yes.
to justify his human rights pronouncement.
Yes.
In fact, earlier on you suggested that what he said depended on the audience that he had.
Yes.
But did that also extend to how he dealt with other interesting topics, like, say, homosexuality, for instance?
I believe at the tail end of his regime and his government, Jammeh made utterances about human rights targeted against gays, and lesbians, or homosexuals, basically to pander to the Middle East in an effort to extract resources. When coffers or state coffers were dwindling in a major way, I believe that Jammeh also used precepts of human rights that were deeply African when it came to homosexuals. He would say, well, this is not African, that this is being imposed on us by the West, and so forth and so on. it didn't have any coherence, it didn't make any sense. But it appealed to a religious, traditional population that, for all I know, are homophobic and have little interest in entertaining the notion that homosexuality may be, for all we know, a tendency in humans as it is in animals. But he didn't have the vocabulary, he didn't have the philosophical or ideological niceties to catch it or to catch those arguments. So he appealed to the lowest denominator that would ensnare people to latch onto what he was saying. It was contradictory, it was not based on science necessarily, but it pandered to the population. And most people, or many people in the Gambia and elsewhere, bought it.
But doesn't it appear that his positions in the early days, when he did not accumulate such awesome power, subsequently changed
Yes.
when he became very, very powerful? I refer to paragraph 66 of your report,
Yes.
wherein at the outset he talked about the press being the watchdog
Yes.
of society. Tell us about that and how he subsequently handled the press.
Initially, Jammeh and his pronouncements on human rights was very Western. He believed in individual freedoms, freedoms of expression. Journalists were to be the fourth estate, and they were to serve as the watchdogs of the new political dispensation. Over time, that changed. As he accumulated more power, and as his views diverged from his actions, or his pronouncements diverged from his actions, journalists began to challenge him as he had instructed. And this was to create a lot of angst on his part. So initially, yes, human rights, in his view, came from a more Western perspective. It was a very populist perspective as well. It was also very Africanist in some ways, appealing as much as he could to the larger population and mimicking what others had said in Ghana, or Rawlings had said in Ghana. He began to ridicule journalists. He began to attack them. He began to burn their buildings and presses.
Could you read out the second half
Okay.
of paragraph 66,
Okay.
starting with the sentence, "This would, however, change
Yes.
drastically"?
Yes. This would, however, change drastically when Jammeh singled out journalists for ridicule, vile insults, and targeted killings and disappearances. Data, however, was gunned down in December 2004 by agents in Jammeh's pay, while it is widely believed that journalist Chief Ibrahim Amani, who was subjected to enforced disappearance by one of Jammeh's private military outfits. So it changed drastically, especially as you got increasingly threatened by journalists.
And you argue that that is just a reflection of some of the things Jammeh had learned from Rawlings, right?
Part of it, yes.
And in fact, excuse me, I think that's excuse me, I forgot to turn off my mobile phone. It's in silence, but it should have been off. Thank you very much. But he did not only attack journalists physically. He used other means
Yes.
to do that. And I refer to you, paragraph 69 of,
Yes.
of your report. Could you read out paragraph 69?
Absolutely. Added to these were odious decrees 70 and 71 from the time of military rule and the 2002 Media Commission Bill issued by the APRC to muzzle what otherwise was a relatively free and vibrant press in the First Republic. For instance, under Jammeh's watch, premises of the independent newspaper was torched, resulting in significant loss of equipment and injury to a guard who secured the premises. The newspaper publisher and editor-in-chief, our Baba Gala Jallo, and Alaji Yoro Jallo, managing editor of the Independent, subsequently left the country for the USA. They were regarded Halifa Sallah, Sidi Jata, Data Hydra, Pap Sen, Babukar Gay, Ibrahim Sise, Ibrahim Sankare, just to name a few, were amongst the first victims of Chairman Jammeh's media crackdown in 1995. As a matter of fact, Sallah and Jatta were subsequently charged with a technical breach of the law. Babukar Gay in particular was to also suffer immense repression from the regime following closure of his radio station, Citizen FM, in 1998.
In fact,
Yes.
one of the first attempts of the AFPRC government to bring a case against individuals for violation of what they termed an important law was against PDOIS, Halifa Sallah and Sidi Ajata, who were charged for publishing a newspaper without going through the prescriptions of the law.
Yes.
Do you recall that?
Yes, in fact.
And that happened in early days, almost before the end of 1994.
95, yes.
Sometime around October 1994.
Absolutely.
And that was their first attack on the media. But that wouldn't be the last, would it?
No.
In your report, here you indicated other attacks on the media, including Babukar Gay, George Christensen, and others.
Lauren Foster.
And Lauren Foster.
Yes.
That's right. But it was also not limited to just those individuals. But what you dubbed as a honeymoon between Jammeh and the press ended quite abruptly and was very short-lived.
Yes. I used Dr. Ibrahim Asise's term there. The honeymoon quickly ended when he basically went after the journalists and others he perceived to be threats to his regime.
I mean, even lawyers
Yes.
whose responsibility it is to ensure fair trials and respect for rights of people who are charged with crimes or people who come into brush with the law were also targeted.
Absolutely.
We've seen Mr. Usman Sina, who was the target of an assassination attempt.
Yes.
And we are yet to hear that case before the commission. Hopefully, in sometime in the future, we will be in a position to lead evidence as to what really were the underlying facts leading to his attempted assassination.
Yes.
But all these, as you stated in paragraph 71, created a climate of fear and culture of silence. That is your position, right?
Yes.
Could you kindly take us through that? I am looking at the second paragraph, para 71, page 26, the last sentence.
Okay.
Starting with "in the end."
In the end, yes. In the end, fear and so-called culture of silence enveloped the entire country, and ordinary citizens were not spared Jammeh's wrath, as rights to assembly were feared and frowned upon by the regime.
But one bit that I have not seen in the report,
Yes.
perhaps maybe you can talk about it, is the culture of silence that stemmed from fear by the people of their domestic workers themselves. Fear that the NIA is in their own bedrooms,
Yes.
in their own kitchens, and in their own living rooms. And therefore, they could not say anything even within the four corners of their homes.
Yes. That was a much talked about issue. And I might have made some fleeting mention of it. But you're right, I didn't give it as much prominence as maybe I should have. There was fear even within families, because the idea was he had infiltrated many family settings. A wife may be APRC. The husband might be something else. And this left some families and some marriages strained because of mutual suspicion. This didn't bode well, certainly, for those families and human rights in the country.
The fear was so pervasive that for some, the cracking of the door
Yes.
or the gate at 9 p.m.
Yes.
sent chills in their bodies. Could you say something about that?
Yes. Or being woken up in the middle of the night, blindfolded, taken away. The fear that it inspired in the individual that was arrested or taken away was tremendous, not even to speak of the family members that were left behind. It was horrendous. And this, as a result, made many people fearful of saying anything. Respected elders would sometimes be carried off. Even amongst the intelligentsia, most of them remained quiet for fear of being picked up by the NIA. So this culture of silence, as you suggested, was pervasive.
And religious rights, they were not spared either.
Yes.
Could you tell us how Jammeh dealt with religious rights? Pretty much the freedom of worship,
Yes.
freedom of assembly.
Typically, the Gambia has a fairly good record when it comes to religious tolerance and the protection of religious rights. Something that we overlook, though, is the Ahmadiyya, who are a smaller Muslim minority group. In fact, in some circles, they are not considered Muslim. I remember when I came in 2017, there was a schism over a gentleman who needed to be buried in a cemetery. I don't recall the facts right now, but the idea was he was not going to be buried in the cemetery because he was Ahmadiyya, among other things. Now, these may not represent state violations. These may be violations by others who take it upon themselves to challenge and limit the enjoyment of certain rights by other people. Christians also when, maybe I'm going ahead of the testimony, but Christians did suffer when Jammeh declared the Gambia an Islamic state and forced or tried to force women to dress in a particular way. So what I'm suggesting is, as much as there was respect for religious rights, there were some potential violations.
Can't it be argued that that was just Jammeh's way
Yes.
of pandering to the Arab world, seeing that the so-called Allah's Bank had
Yes.
disappeared and there were no longer free money coming in. So he wanted to appeal to the Arab world.
I couldn't agree more. I agree.
But nonetheless, you have an issue with the declaration itself.
Yes, I do.
It was unlawful.
Yes.
It was unfair.
Very.
It was improper.
Yes.
And to start its implementation, rights were violated.
Yeah.
And people kept quiet.
Yes.
Nothing happened. Perhaps maybe funds did not come through, so the issue just got lost.
Yeah, fizzled, yes.
It fizzled out.
Yes.
Could have been a dangerous situation.
It could have been. And I do agree with you, Counsel, that he was basically pandering to religious undercurrents expressed in the Middle East.
But let me take you to task on
Yes.
a very important issue.
Please.
And how can we protect the Gambia and Gambians from such dictatorial action, suddenly shifting the state from one orientation to another on the basis of religion, like declaring the country an Islamic state, or a pagan state, or an atheist state? How do we protect this society and the people from that?
That's a very good question, Lead Counsel. I subscribe to this very controversial term, secular. I think the Gambia needs to be a secular state where all rights are respected by the state, taking no preference for one religion or the other. I have written on these in some other areas. But my conviction is that perhaps it's the surest guarantee of protecting the rights of the majority, but more importantly, the rights of religious minorities. You see, as I have argued elsewhere, we Gambians tend to subscribe or are inflicted by the plague of majoritism, where we basically take for granted our privileges as a Muslim majority state. And with that comes some privileges, which include, among others, to dismiss or not condone or listen to the views of minorities, including Christians and traditionalists, who may have a different religious take. What I'm suggesting is we need to be more open-minded. We need to be more, we need to have empathy. Having lived in a country where I was deemed a minority and fighting for the rights of all kinds of people, I am very sensitive as a Gambian when I fear or perceive the rights of minorities, women in particular, being trampled upon. And I think the notion of secular is being misrepresented, in my view, in this country. Secular only guarantees the separation of state and church or the mosque. Granted, I do understand that in Islam, there is no separation of state and the mosque. It is a holistic concept. But in this day and age, and if we subscribe to fundamental human rights embodied in the Universal Declaration, and as a state, I think we must inject that notion of secular.
Well, this debate is raging.
Yes.
Obviously, your viewpoints have been heard.
Yes.
I say no further
Yes.
on that because we do not want to necessarily inject ourselves into that difficult question.
Yes. Thanks for the opportunity anyway.
Thank you very much. But that said, Jammeh's threats were not just limited to a direct and deliberate attack on secularism or on the rights of the minorities when he declared the
Yes.
Gambia an Islamic state. Much as he didn't do anything significant to reinforce that, apart from a few billboards here and there, which shows the Islamic Republic of the Gambia, and religious statements displayed all around, Allahu Akbar everywhere almost. He didn't do much to reinforce that. But there was, and in fact, a more significant event, which was a direct threat on the existence of an ethnic group in this country. Could you comment on that?
I am happy to, Counsel. Yahya Jammeh, in his effort to gain an upper hand in the impending elections, weaponized ethnicity. And
Could you say that again? Could you take that again?
I said, Yahya Jammeh, in an effort to have the upper hand in the impending elections, weaponized ethnicity.
That is a very strong statement.
Yes.
He
Well,
weaponized ethnicity.
Yes.
Could you explain that?
he used it as an instrument to target the Mandinka ethnic group. He vilified them, and in doing so was also trying to attack Honorable Usain Dabo, his major opponent. He said things that I probably wouldn't want to repeat against the Mandinka, that they weren't in particular from this part of the country, that they are not really members of this community, among other things. And this was very disturbing. I think what it tried to do, what Jammeh tried to do in saying so many things like that, was again to isolate the Mandinka ethnic speaking population, rally the minorities around him, and in doing so gain a larger vote over time. But the irony was, during the preceding elections, many Mandinkas voted overwhelmingly for him. But he was to pay for that in the 2016 elections.
Earlier on, you just described it as leader gone mad. Maybe this time around it was leader gone madder.
Yes.
And of course, Jammeh went on to violate, in fact, other rights, apart from the rights of the Mandinka as an ethnic group to exist in this country, because what he said pretty much bordered on incitement to genocide.
Absolutely.
But other rights also were under the Universal Declaration were also affected by Jammeh's actions. You talked about the right to fair trial, how that also suffered.
Yes.
Could you tell us more about that?
Well, the legitimacy of the courts had been butchered under Jammeh. Many felt that going to court and the verdict in most instances was a foregone conclusion. The Nigerian mercenary judges would rule in his favor, in Jammeh's favor. So he used the courts and the so-called mercenary judges in an effort to quell any kind of dissent against him. So the idea of a free trial became alien under Jammeh. And
I am made to understand. Unfortunately, I wasn't here to appreciate all the nuances.
I wasn't here either.
Around that. Well, you did the research, Professor. I am made to understand that it was not only Nigerian mercenary judges, but there were also compliant Gambian judges.
Yes, Country said something about that earlier, but yeah, you're right.
Who would receive a telephone call and would just do as they were directed.
They were. And some of them served as ministers of justice and attorney general or attorneys generals. And I mean, I found these individuals and their actions all the more troubling because they had really surrendered, compromised their professional oath and integrity. I may be very strong sometimes. I can be strong in terms of what I say.
Okay, let's examine this and be fair to all those people. I'm not suggesting they were right or wrong, but let's just bring out the facts.
Okay.
A lot of them were given positions, later arrested and detained on false charges, released, reappointed, arrested and detained, and that secured compliance and would secure compliance for most people, wouldn't it?
It would. But I'm saying also there were so many other counsel who didn't comply. They would either leave the country and decide not to take a position and not even have an income. So,
in a sense, what we are saying here is that compliance is no option, because compliance would secure sustenance, and sustenance would mean we would continue to wallow under critical conditions of palpable violation of rights.
I can appreciate that, and I don't really want to sit here and judge those who complied and worked with Jammeh, because I couldn't really walk in their moccasins. The situation was tense, it was difficult, and sometimes lack of compliance could end up in being arrested, tortured, and so forth and so on. So I can also see that part of the equation. Sometimes compliance was forced, and most people or some people didn't have a choice. They had to do what they had to do to survive.
So, with regards to the right to fair trial, tell us more about the use of unlawful detention just as a tool to secure compliance or to instill fear.
Fear and repression, yes.
And repression.
I think there was a 72-hour limit as to how long an individual was to be held without being heard or trial. 72 hours at least.
Yes.
And it became another tool, in my view, and in the view of many others, that Jammeh was using this deliberately to keep away people, or to keep people who he felt he couldn't punish as quickly. Keep them in there as long as he could, until all remedies were exhausted before taking them to court.
But in fact, there was also another nefarious system whereby one is detained for an extended period of time and presented to Jammeh for him to forgive the person, so as to give an impression that that individual is being released on the generosity of Jammeh, if I may.
Yes.
How do you see that?
I believe that was an element of his delusional tendencies, his
cunning approach?
Yes, that too, and his attempt to appear magnanimous, his attempt to come across as a Mansa who was very forgiving, but would readily punish severely those who offended him. It was all part of his game. It was all part of his repertoire to basically keep himself in power and to be accepted by the larger population.
There is this interesting combination of legal tools that Jammeh used. The restoration of the death penalty, and the lack of bail for capital offenses. That combination meant one could be put away for a very, very long time just on the mere accusation of a crime that attracted the death penalty. What do you say to that?
Well, that was an egregious violation of rights of individuals. I think people accused of capital crimes ought to have representation, ought to be guaranteed the fundamental right to be heard by a judge or by juries of their peers. And where that was not the case, in my view, is a flagrant violation of the Convention on Political and Civil Rights. And Gambia being a signatory to that, to me, goes to show that these laws and legal mechanisms that he used, maneuvers, were nothing more but tools in his arsenal to maintain power and quell dissent among those whom he perceived to be enemies.
In paragraph 76 of your report, you talked about how he dealt with or how he handled the issue of the death row inmates. Perhaps you can read paragraph 76.
Happy to.
Yes.
Also, with the restoration of the death penalty shortly after the coup, Jammeh used it as a means to fight soaring crime rates. Execution of 9 death row inmates in 2012, ignoring all pleas of clemency, and to commute all sentenced to life, which when unheeded was by far the lowest point in Gambia's criminal injustice system. The execution sent the entire country, an international community, reeling from the sheer miscarriage of justice that had all the sinister makings of political expediency. In some quarters, the executions were viewed as cases of human sacrifice, possibly ordered by Jammeh's idols to keep himself in power. Given Jammeh's faith in the occult, this is not far-fetched. In fact, both underlying reasons or motives are tenable. It is also clear from numerous witness testimonies at the TRRC that there were numerous instances of alleged extrajudicial killings by APRC junta members and their underlings sanctioned by Jammeh himself. November 11th, 1994 victims, as well as the killing of Usman Korosise by Edward Singate, Alaji Kanyi, Yankuba Toure, and Peter Singate, revealed that Yahya Jammeh was complicit in these murders. The rule of law, and especially the right to trial, free trial, was generally denied citizens. These were compounded further by disproportionate punishments meted out for alleged crimes. This became the hallmark of both the AFPRC and APRC under Jammeh.
We have, well, the Commission would hear in the next few days the case of Imam Babali, whose only crime was to plead publicly with Jammeh not to carry out the executions of the death row inmates.
Yes.
And for that, he had to go in and be subjected to a lot of torture.
Yes.
That just shows, doesn't it, the extent of Jammeh's powers. From when has begging a person to apply the law properly become a crime that would attract arrest, detention, and torture for almost a year?
No.
And people kept quiet. Do you have an opinion on that?
I do. And to me it was a severe misuse of the law against a person, religious person in particular, who had a fundamental right to express how he felt about executions. In almost all over the world, executions are a thing of the past. And Sadada had actually had basically ended executions, but they brought it back, the AFPRC. I think it was the very lowest point when Imam Babali and Fofana and a few others were arrested, tortured, for merely expressing views that were guaranteed by the Constitution that he himself sanctioned, and fundamental human rights that, Gambia is a signatory to. Of course, this doesn't matter. These things didn't matter to Jammeh. I get emotional. These things didn't matter to Jammeh at all. It didn't matter.
How about the right to vote? Perhaps we take this as the last point, Mr. Chair, and then we call it a day until tomorrow. The right to vote.
The right to vote, important as it is, was also used by Jammeh in an effort to keep himself in power, except in the last election, when he agreed to on-the-spot counting. Otherwise, the elections were rigged for the most part. They were engineered from the very beginning of the electoral process to ensure his victory. So while Gambians went to vote on a regular basis from 1996 to 2011, these elections were for the most part managed or macro-managed by the Jammeh establishment in cohorts, for the most part, with the IEC to deliver a victory. So in a sense, while the rights were enshrined in the Constitution, in practice they were violated. It didn't mean much because the ballot boxes were stuffed. He tried to basically intimidate the current chair into changing the numbers so as to ensure his victory in the last election.
I heard of an interview by the former IEC chairman, was it Mr. Carroll, who I heard, Mr. Carroll, who I had suggested, I have to choose my words carefully, suggested, intimated that the votes were rigged. Did you hear that statement?
That he never rigged the elections?
That Jammeh rigged the elections.
Okay, I think I did, yes.
Yes, so that reinforces what you have just said, that was a massive violation of the right to vote.
Absolutely, yes.
And that stemmed from the fact that he would single-handedly appoint the commissioners and chairman of the Electoral Commission.
And he could dismiss them as he wished.
And for the purposes of institutional reform, what would you say about that?
I don't think the president should be in the business of appointing the IEC.
Well, if you have to choose your own arbiter, your own referee, you definitely would choose a referee that would be favorable to you, wouldn't you?
Well, no. I mean, if you're really dedicated to the principles of fair play and democratic ethos, however the game may turn out to be, even if not in your favor, I think those principles should be upheld.
Should we be so trusting as to entrust the player with the responsibility of choosing his own referee?
No, I think there ought to be checks and balances.
And that
Oversight.
And that would be your recommendation?
Yes.
That the president should have no business
Yes.
in choosing the head
Of the
or
IEC.
the commissioners of the IEC.
Yes.
If you are a player, you don't choose the referee.
Yes.
Thank
I
you
agree.
very much. Mr. Chair, perhaps this is a convenient point to stop until tomorrow.
Thank you very much indeed, Council, and thank you very much, Professor Saine, for coming to assist us and for us to get a better understanding of what really happened in this country, and in particular, Jammeh's mindset and what the situation was in his regime. Thank you. We will continue our proceedings tomorrow, and we hope to get more from you. And that is a very useful afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Cisse.
So we'll resume our proceedings tomorrow, 10 o'clock in the morning. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.